Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm finally getting around to doing a top 10 player ranking that I've seen requested a bit and one I've definitely wanted to do, especially now that we have 4 seasons of the new era under our belts, and that is to do my top 10 players of the new era, essentially after the second cycle of seasons with the new format, which surprisingly ended up being a pretty difficult list to put together. I think we're already at the point where narrowing this down to just 10 players is cutting out some pretty big names and some pretty big players, which ended up leading to some pretty tough cuts at the end of this list. But either way, I'll be talking about who I think are the top 10 players to have played between seasons 41 and 44, based on how strong of players I think they are in the grand scheme of Survivor, meaning mixing in how they played on their season with also their prospects on any given season. But before we get into the proper top 10, I do want to talk about my honorable mentions first, which I guess we'll talk through in chronological order. So from Survivor 41, someone that was extremely close to actually making the list, despite her being the lowest placing player to even be in consideration for this list, I did very much consider Shan. And again, I think Shan demonstrated a lot of impressive ability getting through the entire Uwa tribe, getting down to just her and Ricard, her essentially building these relationships and breaking them for the sake of keeping Ricard around. And then once we get to the merge, she's able to completely rebuild her power structure and is able to really run the game until the mid-merge phase of the game. Again, there's a lot to like from Shan's game, especially considering she only ended up getting 8th place. But again, when it comes to the top 10 here, I do feel like she barely misses out. I mean, before Survivor 44, I think she probably would have been in the top 10. Though I do think the few people that made it from that season ended up bumping her out of it, but still a very solid player all around. Also, I did consider Danny McRae, who very much just feels like a very well-rounded player. I mean, he's obviously very good physically. He was very well liked socially, and I do think if he had gotten to the end, he would have won in a decent amount of scenarios, while also strategically, he's no slouch either. Now, I will say I do think he makes a strategic misstep in him voting out Shan when he does, which I do think was a misguided play. Though, to be fair, it's a misguided play that we also see someone else make in the top 10. But I will say the reason why Danny's not in the top 10 for me is because I do feel like Danny, at least at the time of 41, was a bit less dynamic than what I would have wanted him to be, to where, while he does do a very good job at building relationships after the merge, and again, seem to have people on the jury that actively wanted to vote for him, I do feel like in the pre-merge, I don't feel like he was building up enough really strong relationships, especially in comparison to someone else that makes the top 10. While he lets go Sydney, one of his closest allies, once he gets to the merge, and I just feel like there's these minor missteps along the way that feel like him being a bit too passive in the game that left him off the list. Also from Survivor 41, the first finalist we're going to be talking about here, I also considered Xander, who did not make it on. And Xander's just kind of a tough player to assess, because I think Xander's another one of these that is a pretty well-rounded player. Again, he is pretty good physically. Strategically, he's solid, even though he had some pretty poor reads at points. And socially, he's fine. I mean, to be fair, he's not the best social player in the world, but considering his pretty bad spot coming into the merge, he was still able to get all the way to Final 3. Mind you, eventually got to a point where just no one really respected him, and that's why he got to the end. And he just further continued to prove the jury's point in him making these decisions that seemed misguided, particularly in him taking Erica to the end. But I do think Xander as a whole is still a competent player, one that had some impressive maneuvering through the game and was able to build some strong relationships with Erica and Heather and with Ricard once his core alliance broke up. So again, I do think there are some impressive aspects to his game, but again, not quite enough to make it to the top 10. Now moving on to Survivor 42, where the first honorable mention here ends up being Lindsay. And Lindsay was actually kind of a surprise to me that she didn't make the list. I think there is an argument that Lindsay could crack the top 10. As again, I think Lindsay's another one of these pretty well-rounded players. I think she's very good physically. She's pretty decent socially, and strategically, again, she definitely isn't the strongest in the world, but she's not that bad at it either. I think she's a very well-rounded player, and one that got to the final 5 with a decent amount of win equity, and almost had Marion even being willing to give her an advantage in the final 5 immunity challenge, and all that is pretty impressive. Though really as a whole, I do look at her as someone that I question a bit on her overall fluidity in the game. I don't know how willing she is able to do to turn against her allies. However, I do question her overall cutthroatness in the game. I don't know if she really has the killer instinct instinct in most scenarios, especially in Survivor 42, where she wanted to go to the end of Omer, which, again, we don't know for sure if Lindsay would have been Omer or not, but I still don't think it's her optimal path to the end, where there were definitely other people that she would have very clearly beaten over him. Well, also, she does make this strategic blunder not playing the idol on Omer at the final 6, which I think was another thing that, again, made me question her overall strategic prowess, which was enough to leave her off the list. Also, I did end up considering Jonathan, which might be a question mark, because I do feel like a lot of people don't really look at Jonathan as that good of a player nowadays. I think a lot of people look at him as this guy that pissed off some of the women on his tribe and didn't really have a chance at winning when he got towards the end. And while, again, like, that is pretty much true, I do feel like at the same time he had some pretty impressive play along the way. And the fact that he is this massive guy who should have been in the mold of this, like, Joe Anglim or Malcolm and how big of a threat that they're going to be coming into the merge, he's able to avoid that target, being a main orchestrator of this majority alliance that forms at the merge that essentially keeps around all the big threats. Like, I do think that was a pretty decent play from him. Also, again, like, even though it's not really on the show, the entire idol nullifier situation that involves him sniffing out that Omer and Lindsay are coming for him, and he ends up being the initial one to actually go for Omer to begin with. And again, I think that's pretty impressive play as well. Now, again, his lack of win equity and his pretty bad social tendencies at points does leave him off of this top 10, but I do think there is more to give him credit from a gameplay perspective than many people think. So again, I at least wanted to mention him here. Also, another runner-up we're going to mention here from Survivor 42, I do have Mike, who, again, is another one of these that was pretty close to making the list. I believe Mike was on my initial draft of the list. However, I did end up knocking him off, largely because, one, that list was made before Survivor 44 finished, and when they got added, essentially Mike got dropped off. But really beyond that, like, I just always struggled with, like, how to really assess Mike's game, where I think Mike is a player that on paper you would think of him as someone that had a decent amount of agency and control. However, I don't know how much of that was really the case. Again, early on he was part of this duo with Jenny and was able to get Daniel and Chanel to go to his side, but once the Jenny vote happened, he instantly flips on Daniel. But I feel like a lot of it just comes off as kind of emotional, more so than him doing so strategically, and I think that is really how a lot of his endgame plays out as well, where he targets Hai simply because Omer told him that Hai's been talking about how he's been running Mike's game, and it just feels like Mike was someone that was so easily emotionally manipulated into doing things that kind of does question how I would assess him. Now, like, outside that, again, he is a solid player socially. He seemed to be pretty well liked while out there. Strategically, again, there were points that he does pretty well, though there's also other points where he seemed to be pretty aloof, particularly at Final Tribal, where he came into it being at a near tie, though ends up losing a lot of those votes at Final Tribal, partially due to how unaware of his own game he ended up being. Again, overall, I do think he is a solid player, but one that I just feel like is so flawed. It was tough to actually fit him in the top 10 here, despite the fact that, again, he comes into the endgame with a lot of win equity. But next up, we're moving on to 43, where we only have a couple honorable mentions here. Let's start off with Carla, who, again, like, this one's more so me mentioning her for the sake of it. I don't feel like Carla is as good of a player as what the 43 edit kind of portrayed her as. For a while, I do think there is some decent game sense from her, and she did kind of run the initial Coca tribe. I don't feel like she ran it well. I feel like she did it in a position where she was getting rid of these people that wanted to actively work with her, and continue to do that after the merge as well, and letting James go, wanting to target Cassidy, and essentially got herself into this endgame position where she really had no one by her side. Mind you, she got to the final 5 with a lot of win equity, where I think if she was at the end against any of the final 5 outside of Jesse, I think she handily wins. But I think there was a lot of misguided strategic play along the way that does keep her off the list for me. But the other honorable mention here from Survivor 43 ends up finally being the only winner of the new era to not be in the top 10, and that ends up being Gabler. And Gabler's just kind of a weird player to assess, and the fact that obviously Gabler's win really kind of came out of nowhere. And straight up, like, I think Gabler is a better player than some people give him credit for. There's some people that look at his win as a complete train wreck and that he was a terrible player the entire time, and I don't necessarily agree with that. Again, I do think Gabler, while again had some questionable strategic tendencies early on especially, I think was a pretty solid social player. While again, like, his handling of the Ellie situation was not ideal, and wasn't necessarily someone that was really controlling many votes, I do feel like he ends up being a pretty stable strategic presence in the game, also being a pretty well-liked person while out there, and was also pretty aware of what endgame situations he could win in, with him actively striving for the Owen Cassie final 3 that he actually ended up going with, and recognizing he needed to cut Cody and Jesse and Carla along the way. And I do think there is some decent awareness in his game, but again, it's just the lack of agency throughout some of it, and also some misguided play that does leave him off my top 10. And finally, we'll move on to Survivor 44, where this might be the most controversial honorable mention of the bunch. Someone that was obviously really hyped up during the season. However, I do have Carolyn as honorable mention. And Carolyn ends up being a player here that, to me, I do think is probably a bit overrated by the general community. Like, you see so much talk about how Carolyn should have won, and Carolyn was this incredible player. However, I really never saw it that way. I think Carolyn is, again, a good player. I think there are some good moves she makes along the way, particularly the Sarah vote. I think that is a very impressive move she makes there. However, outside that, I feel like the rest of the moves she makes across the season are moves that she makes alongside the rest of the Tikas. Now, again, a lot of people give her credit for the idol play, a final 7. However, I personally don't, considering it doesn't really do anything. I mean, yes, it is probably an optimal move for her to be using her idol in that situation, a situation where you're unsure where Lauren and Jamie's votes are going. However, it, again, didn't matter. And really what mattered more was Carson and Jam's relationships with Jamie and Lauren that caused them to still vote with them. I think there are multiple points in the season where she wants to target Danny in particular and continues to fail at targeting him, with none of her alliance ending up listening to her. And really, again, I just feel like she's the least integral to the overall success of the Tika alliance, where it felt like Xander and Carson had so many really strong personal relationships that allowed the Tikas to really play the middle, while Carolyn really kind of just felt like a tag along throughout a lot of it. And again, she is still a solid player. I think she has a very good strategic mind for the game. Again, I think she was very aware of her game, but to me, that doesn't really change the fact that I still think she is for sure the lesser of the Tikas. But even then, in comparison to the people in the actual top 10, I feel like a lot of them either had more agency in the game or had more win equity, or are players that are probably more well-rounded than Carolyn, where I think Carolyn is the type of player that is extremely high variance. I think she's someone that could easily be one of the first few boots on any given season, especially due to her lack of physical prowess, and it's really that high variance, plus also really her game on 44 just being kind of middle of the road that really leaves her off the list for me. And the final honorable mention here from 44 ends up being the other runner-up from 44, and that ends up being Heidi. And again, Heidi was not particularly close to making the list, though I at least wanted to mention her here as a player that, again, made it to the end. I don't think she really had a winning scenario towards the end, but I do think she makes some decent moves here and there, and she's in the middle of Soka for a lot of the pre-merge. She is the one to first bring up the names of Brandon and Kane. She throws herself into fire in a position where she knows that she needs to build up more clout with the jury. I think there are good things she does, though there's also points where she's completely on the outs of what's happening, particularly the Franny and Danny votes. So again, a mixed bag of a game that ends up leaving her off the list. But that's all the honorable mentions. Now let's get into the actual top 10, which ends up being a pretty balanced top 10 here. Again, I didn't really strive for this, but ends up being one where every season has at least 2 players from it, but no more than 3. So with that, let's start off the top 10 with a player coming from Survivor 41, a season that has 3 people from this cast on the list. Though again, this one was the one that barely squeezed on here, and that person is DeSean, the runner-up of the season. And DeSean was a bit of a question mark for me, where again, it was a struggle between DeSean, Shan, and Mike. But I ended up going DeSean over the 3 there, and it's a bit weird considering I feel like DeSean does have some pretty glaring holes in his game, and his jury management very much left much to be desired, especially in how he handled himself after the Shan vote, where I think he kind of came off as a very emotional player. Also, his entire voting off of Shan was one that really doomed his game. It was just a pretty bad move in itself. Really, his entire game after the Shan vote is just entirely bad, but his game before the Shan vote I think is really impressive. I mean, his positioning on the original Luvu tribe is very, very strong, where he is in this power duo with Danny, but also builds connections with the likes of Erica and Heather, these relationships that Danny failed to make, and through that puts him in a very strong position. And while the show likes to portray it as Erica was the one that was going to go home if they went to tribal, supposedly the actual truth was that Sydney was going to go home, which would have put him in an even more powerful position there, having isolated Danny. And even at the merge vote, he's able to get the split on Sydney, which ends up weakening Danny in that position, and through that ends up solidifying their alliance. He remains in this power position really up until the Shan vote. And while Shan does get her way over him at points, I do feel like his overall game up to the Shan vote is actually pretty strong. I think it's not far away from being a top tier winner of the show, but then obviously the game completely crumbles following that. But again, in comparison to Shan, obviously he does end up voting out Shan. He is the one to directly outplay her, while with Mike, all the two have two pretty big glaring issues with their games. I feel like I personally would have more faith in DeSean on a return than I would with Mike. I feel like DeSean's issues are easier to fix than Mike's. And I felt like DeSean's gameplay earlier on was much more impressive than Mike's, and because of that, for me, DeSean ends up being here at number 10. Now, number 9, moving on to a player that, again, I did also question if this person should be on the list. This being a player from Survivor 43, one that I do look at as a pretty well-rounded player, even though I don't think her game on that respective season is the greatest. However, that person ends up being Cassie. And again, Cassie obviously makes it to the very end, is the runner-up of the season, but is a runner-up in a position where she got to her optimal final 3 and still loses. I think she's one of these players that I just don't know how she wins the game in most other scenarios. Again, the final 3 people to be booted before, I think she loses against literally everybody, going back as far as at least Noelle. But again, I do look at her as a pretty well-rounded player, one that is decent physically, won a decent amount of challenges, is decent socially. Again, she was a pretty affable figure while out there. Mind you, again, probably not the best social player in the world, but I feel like was good enough, while also strategically, while she did have a couple of poor reads here and there, I feel like she was a pretty stable strategic presence. I do just look at her as a pretty well-rounded player through and through, though one that was probably just a bit too passive, which is the reason why I did question if she should be in the top 10 here. As again, I think there's the argument of like her versus Lindsay, her versus someone like a Danny, her versus even like a Carolyn. I feel like I went with Cassie over them, largely in the fact that Cassie obviously got to the end when they didn't. And while they had more win equity than Cassie, I feel like Cassie was at least aware enough to know what her optimal final 3 scenario was. While again, her being above Carolyn is more so just because I look at her as a more well-rounded player. Like I just look at Cassie as the type of player that's going to make the merge most times she plays, while I feel like Carolyn is the type of player that could easily be the first boot anytime she plays. And I feel like it is that dichotomy that made me convinced to put Cassie on the list here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a player that this might be a bit controversial at this person being relatively low on this list, being the first winner we're going to be talking about on this list. And at number 8, I do have Marion. I was the winner of Survivor 42. And Marion's always been a very conflicting player to me, one that I just don't fully know how I should be assessing her, as there are impressive aspects to her game, obviously. Again, despite the fact that she is this very happy-go-lucky presence, she obviously does know the game pretty well. She is a very cunning player, one that knows to wait until the optimal time to make a move, and she obviously does with the Omer move, which is still a very, very impressive move there, a move that she can solely take credit for. However, it doesn't feel like that really did much for the jury, where based on what we've heard from the jury, I actually felt like her win equity really didn't go up that much through that move. And coming into the final tribal, it was going to be a tie between her and Mike, but the votes stayed the same. And mixing that in the fact that I feel like her game is also just kind of rocky for a decent chunk of it. Again, she did want to try to save Lindsay, despite Lindsay being someone that would beat her at the end. She was kind of on the bottom of Taku, to where if they had gone to another tribal pre-merge, she would have gone home. And really, she had very little agency in the game for most of it, really until that final 6 round. However, I do think something that is impressive about her is that she is pretty aware of her game. Now, I will say that she did exaggerate her game at Final Tribal, which, and good on her for getting people to believe it. Though I think at the end of the day, it also was a bit of an exaggeration, particularly her talk about how locked in she was to make it to the end, which she really wasn't. Neither Mike or Jonathan were actually going to take her to the end. But I think Marion's the type of player that if she makes it to the end, I would have a lot of faith in her building up an argument for her to win. Even though, again, like I think her overall path to that point is almost always going to be rocky. And I think that's also the thing with Marianne, is that she kind of fits into this Carolyn mold in my mind of someone that I'm just not sure how consistently she would do well on Survivor. Again, I think if she does well, she does very well. However, I think there's also many times that she would play and be one of the first few boots. I feel like she just feels like this type of player that on any random season could be a relatively early boot. And through that, it does make me question her overall ability as a player. But again, she's such a likable presence, especially if she makes it to the end of the game, and is someone that is so aware of her game that it does elevate her a bit. But again, I felt like overall, number 8 on the list felt about right for her. Next up, moving back to a player from Survivor 43, and we're really moving on to these players that didn't quite make it to the very, very end of the game, though did make it very far with a good chunk of win equity, while also controlling a decent chunk of the game. But this group is starting off with a player from Survivor 43, that player being Cody. And Cody is a bit of a strange player to assess in the fact that I think he has a very fatal flaw. I do think he is a bit too loyal. I think he is a bit too trusting of his number one ally, and through that I think he puts this unwavering trust in a player, and obviously if that player backstabs him, then he's pretty screwed, as we see on 43. However, I think outside that, Cody was just such a massive threat to win this season. And Cody, based on what the jury have said about him, was the biggest jury threat on the board. He would have probably beaten anybody if he had gotten to the end. Yet despite that, he's still able to make it all the way to Final 6 with the immunity idol kind of in his possession. But again, that leads into his fatal flaw of him being a bit too trusting. But I think Cody's the type of player that, again, I would always expect to make the merge. I think there's really no reason for him to be a relatively early boot on any given season. While also I feel like his loyalty is also a factor that could potentially keep him further into the game. That people are going to recognize the type of player that he is, and that they aren't looking at him as this deceivious, backstabbing player that they need to get out right away. I think that could also boon him in terms of longevity in the game. However, I think he's always going to struggle getting to the very end, where he seems like such a likable presence, and one that is looked at as a big player, to where I don't know if he ever has a easy path to the final 3, though again, in this position he almost got there. And I think just in general, Cody feels like a very consistent player. While he isn't the greatest strategically, which I do think is his major downfall, I do think he's again good physically and very good socially, to where he was just adored by his cast. So really I just feel like he's one of the most consistent players of the new era, and that is why he's here number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a player that, again, kind of is in a similar mold, made it to a similar placement as Cody, with a decent amount of win equity as well, though had different strengths than Cody, and that player comes from Survivor 41, and here we're talking about Ricard. And Ricard is the type of player that, again, I think you can compare to Cody to a degree, though kind of offset the social ability and more so put priority on the strategic game, where I think Ricard's a very solid strategic thinker. I think he is a player with a killer instinct, that he's willing to make these moves that he knows he needs to make to win the game, being willing to cut his closest ally, which again, the move that cut Shan at Final 8 has obviously been criticized, and where again, I still stand by that it's probably a move that he kind of had to make at Final 8, or if he hadn't done so, then Shan and her side of the alliance, which is outright had the majority, will also mean that he would lose out on his own numbers and Erica, Heather, and Xander. So again, I feel like it's a move that he probably should have made, though it's obviously one that makes him a pretty big target relatively early on, and despite that, he's still able to make it all the way to Final 5 in a position where it seems like if he had gotten to the end against anybody but Erica, he would have had a very easy win by the time of the end game. Well, also even against Erica, it would have been a very close vote. Now again, I do think socially he is a bit lacking, to where again, he's good on these one-on-one bonds. He obviously builds a very strong bond with Shan, with Erica, with Xander. However, I do think he very much struggles in bonding with anybody, where I think we saw that on UA, where he seemed to really struggle on UA in building these bonds and had to very much rely on the bonds that Shan was making to navigate through the game, which I do think that is a major issue with his game, as I do think he is a bit inconsistent socially. However, again, I think he's a very savvy strategic player. I think he's a very solid physical competitor, and while again he is flawed socially, he's not necessarily bad either, and because of all these things, again, I think he is a very solid player, and ends up being number 6 here. Number 5, we're moving on to actually the top player from Survivor 42, which I've stated this in the past. I do think the overall level of gameplay of 42 was a bit lower than what we would see from the rest of the new era. And I think this kind of defines that, where at number 5, the top player from 42 ends up being Omer. And again, it is kind of weird that Omer is the top player from this cast, considering he got 6th place, which is higher the lowest placement to actually make the top 10 here. Well, also it doesn't really feel like a super well-rounded player necessarily. Like, I think he is very good socially, and I think he can be very good strategically, though I do wonder if there's a little bit of inconsistency with him, where I just don't feel as confident in the fact that he would always make a deep run as much as I would with someone like a Cody or a Cassidy. Though I do think he did very well in 42, kind of being in the center of the Taku tribe right from the beginning, building a very strong bond with Jonathan and Lindsay and Marion. And once we get to the merge, again, he does a very effective job in solidifying all these other bonds. Like I do think as a whole, he is very good socially. And strategically, I think he did a very good job at navigating the Takus through the game and manipulating the likes of a Mike in order to do his bidding. And again, I do feel like he does a very impressive job at how he navigates through the game. Now, obviously, the bigger knocks for him in terms of why he's not higher on the list is because, one, again, he's 6th place. Still a bit removed from the end. And also, I don't know if he wins if he gets to the end. I don't know if the respect from the jury was as much there as it was with really the rest of the list here. I feel like Omer's the type of player that could get to the end and lose to a bitter jury, especially from what we've heard about his relationship with Drea and Ponderosa. Like, I just feel like there are question marks there. And also, straight up, I do think some of this is factoring in how I've seen him play games outside of Survivor, to where he does seem like a very chaotic player, one that does have some pretty poor reads at points, which again, we didn't really see on the show itself, but I do suspect that's still an aspect of his personality that we haven't really seen on the show itself, that again, leaves enough question marks here to where he doesn't quite reach the upper echelon list, being left here at number 5. Now number 4, moving on to a player that ends up being the top player from Survivor 41, and that player's not surprisingly the winner of the season in Erica. And Erica is a very strange player to talk about, considering even at the time that I did my Survivor 41 player ranking, I was pretty low on Erica. However, since then, I've listened to Exit Press and game recaps, and I've elevated my opinion on Erica quite a bit, where I do feel like Erica at this point is a pretty solid middle tier winner of the show. I do think she got through the first 2/3 of the game. Again, not really having that much agency in the game. Didn't really control that much of what was going on, but was very rarely in danger. Again, while the show tries to portray as she was someone that was going to go home if Luhu had gone to tribal, it does feel like it's pretty much confirmed at this point that Sydney was actually the target over her, and that she did build a strong enough bond with DeSean where he would have wanted to keep her around. And while she does get targeted during the round Hourglass, that was partially due to the fact that she was gone because of the Hourglass twist to begin with. So while you can say that she got saved by the Hourglass, she was also kind of screwed by the Hourglass to begin with. And then beyond that, she's not really in the core majority for the next few rounds, but she's not really being targeted either, and does end up building a really strong bond with the likes of Xander and Ricard during those rounds, to where by the time they flip the game on Shan, she really ends up being in the pretty power position from that point forward, largely due to her connection to Heather, that really allow her to control the rest of the post-merge, which definitely elevates my opinion of her game. Like, I do feel like she plays kind of a near perfect game for the new era, this game where you peak at the very end. This game that doesn't typically allow for these players that really dominate the entire game to quite make it to the very end. And through that, I feel like Erica plays a very strong game for what the new era is. Now, at the end of the day, again, I still feel like there is a level of inconsistency with Erica, where I could definitely see Erica being one of the first few boots on any given season. And again, she didn't have that agency in the first 2/3 of the game that the top 3 end up having. But I do think she is a solid winner. And again, I think I've gotten to the point where I think she is easily the best player from 41. Despite what I've said in my video, which was with incomplete information at that point. But again, still not quite enough to quite reach the upper echelons of the list, which is why she's here at number 4. Now, number 3, we're moving on to finally the first person on the formal list from Survivor 44, where it is funny that only 2 people from Survivor 44 make the list, though both of those players are in the top 3. However, at number 3, we're starting that off with Carson, where, again, Carson to me plays a very, very strong game for the new era, one that really has him playing the middle for really most of the game, and he is really well at positioning himself through the game and allowing him to make moves without having people come after him directly afterwards. Now, it does obviously catch up to him by the end, where by the time of the final 6, it seemed like he was pretty consensusly talked about as the biggest threat on the board, though he does still have some very impressive work along the way. Again, on the original Tika tribe, he's in the middle there. He is the decision maker between Jam and Carolyn and Sarah and Helen. When he gets swapped over, he is still able to integrate within the Ratus to the point where they fully trust him coming to the merge. Then he's the main information broker for the Tikas during those first few rounds, which in essence put him at the front of the Tika Alliance, which is part of the reason why he is targeted as early as he is, but it's still also something that gives him a lot of power in the game. That gives him all these strong one-on-one bonds with, again, already having the Tikas, but also still building that strong bond with the Ratus, while also seemingly building a really strong bond with Danny. That really leads them being in the center of really everything. And again, I do think he is the main strategic decision maker for the Tika Alliance, to where we do see a lot of talks between him and Jam, but it does seem like Carson gets his way in situations where Jam doesn't. And I feel like just as a whole, Carson plays a very impressive game, one that has him playing the middle, getting his way for a lot of the game. But I think the main thing that makes me put him lower on the list than the top 2 is I do feel like his overall potential making it to the very end is just very low. Like, I just don't really see a situation where anyone actually takes Carson to the end. And considering also his pretty poor fire-making skills as well, I just feel like he was always going to struggle to getting to the very end, despite the fact that he would have won easily if he had gotten there. So again, I do think there are some minor negatives there, though still as a whole played an extremely dominant game, especially for new era standards, and that's why he's here number 3. Now number 2, moving on to a player that I've compared Carson's game to this person, and I still stand by it. However, which one was better than the other was a bit up in the air, but at number 2, higher than Carson, I decided to go with Jesse. And again, for me, Jesse was a bit tough to assess here. And the fact that, again, to me, Jesse and Carson's games are very, very similar. They both play the middle on their original tribes, being the main decision maker between 2 pairs. Once he gets their merge, he ends up building these really strong bonds with people outside of his original tribe, building this Final 3 deal with Gabler, and having this really strong relationship with Carla, and is able to really play the middle for most of the post-merge, just like Carson was able to. However, I think the main difference really comes from their end games. I think this is the point of contention for me, and where I think you could argue it both ways, where essentially the end game for both these players is a situation where obviously the result ends up being, yes, they're both the biggest threat at the end. They're both taken out at 4 because they're the biggest threat, and they would have won handily if they had gotten to the end. However, there's a bit of a difference in terms of the lead up to that, where Carson ends up being the biggest threat because of him being looked at as the head of the Tika Alliance for most of the season, essentially meaning that his target kind of grew on him naturally, just through him navigating through the game alongside the Tikas, while Jesse's target on his back was largely manufactured by himself. He intentionally put a target on his back through taking out Cody and making that massive move that he did, where again, through the fact that he also had an idol for 5, he was essentially gambling on the fact that he would win fire making or final immunity to get himself to the end, which again, I still stand by is a good move. I still feel like it's a move that he had to make. I feel like at the end of the day, if he had not made a move like that, I do feel like Cody would have beaten him at the end. And I feel like he needed a move like that to really secure his winning chances, as really if he did not make that move, again, more than likely Cody just wins out from that point forward. So again, it's still a move I do stand by for Jesse, even though it did put him in a very rocky endgame position, but I think it is that makes me put him above Carson. It's the fact that essentially it was the decision he made that caused him to be a target, where there were other paths for him, where if he didn't make that decision to take out Cody probably does get to the end where he loses, but at least there's still a path for Jesse to get to the end. Like, I do think Jesse just overall managed his threat level a bit better. That allowed him to have the choice on whether or not he becomes a threat, where Carson was more so in this position where he was forced to be a threat, which again, I think you can argue being better in the sense that Carson would have won against anybody, while Jesse needed to take Cody out to win. However, to me, it also indicates that Carson's threat management was just worse than Jesse's. So again, I think you could argue it either way. However, I do think Jesse's threat management was better, but then also probably just had minor things that come off as more impressive to me, in the fact that he's able to get 2 allies to give him idols, to which he ends up essentially keeping both of them. Obviously has the massive Cody move, which is very impressive for him to pull off, and even beyond that, I feel like I would have more faith in Jesse on a random season than I would with Carson, where I feel like Carson's probably not one of these players that I could see being a bit high variance, while I feel like Jesse's someone that I don't see as much being high variance, where I could see Jesse kind of blending in with most groups. And that's kind of why, at the end of the day, I did go Jesse over Carson here at number 2. Now, number 1, the best player of the new era, should not be that big of a surprise based on who's left to talk about. And at number 1, we have the winner of Survivor 44. We have Jam Jam. Now, again, like I mentioned this in the past, I do think there is an argument for Jam Jam or Carson. I think Carson's someone that I think beats Jam Jam at the end, even though Jam Jam himself has said that he thinks that he wins, which I will say does kind of worry me in the sense that I do think Jam Jam did have some suboptimal reads at points. Again, him wanting to get rid of Carolyn throughout the end game, thinking that she's a threat, but also still talking about him potentially wanting to go to the end with Carson was just a weird reads from his game. Again, the way he plays the game is just very impressive. Again, he is working alongside Carson for most of the game, and through that, Carson's navigation through the game is really Jam Jam's navigation through the game, which again is overall just very impressive, especially considering it did feel like it was a joint effort between two. And again, while there are points where Carson does get his way, I did feel like Jam Jam did have some pretty impressive play along the way way as well, particularly his relationship with Jamie, which is part of why Jamie and Lauren ended up voting to vote out Danny over them and really just give Tika the outright control after that. Also, Jam Jam faced a lot of adversity on this season, was able to overcome that. Now, while some of that was on him, particularly the losing of Sarah, again, it kind of comes from a twist from Josh being swapped over for the idol. Though also even beyond that, I do feel like he's able to fix that the following round, where despite the fact that Carolyn leaves him out in the vote there, he's able to rebond with Carolyn, where it feels pretty clear they would have voted out Josh had they gone to another tribal. Even beyond that, we do see Jam Jam also be on the bottom during the split tribal, where it's Matt or Jam Jam. And while I don't really credit Jam Jam that much for staying there, as I do feel like there's a lot of reasons to vote out Matt, I do credit Jam Jam a lot with building a relationship with the Ratus in that position, which seemed to, again, just kind of get him out of that bottom position and him kind of fixing his game in that position. And mixing that with the fact that, again, I think Jam Jam is one of the most likable presences to ever be on Survivor, and also ends up having some pretty perfect threat management on this season, really keeping around these massive shields around him and cutting them at the right moments. Now, again, I do question if he would have actually cut Carson at the end and how he would have done it against him, but the fact that, again, no one really looked at Jam Jam as this massive target in comparison to Carson, when Jam Jam himself was a massive threat that probably would have won against most other people other than Carson, I think is a massive boon to his overall game ability. Again, Jam Jam's just the type of person that I can't imagine Jam Jam going early. I feel like he's just a person that you just instantly attach to and love to be around, where while I could see him being a big threat towards the end of the game on certain other seasons where there aren't as big of threats for him to actually keep around him, I also just feel like he's a very consistent player, probably being one of the strongest social players we've ever seen on Survivor. And while, again, strategically I don't think he's up to par with Jesse or Carson, I do feel like he's still a very solid strategic player and one that played probably the most dominant winning game of the new era, with him, again, seemingly being part of the major decision making with the Tikas, where I did feel like it was a lot of him and Carson formulating what to do. And again, it felt like it was Jam Jam's relationships with the Ratus and also Danny and Heidi that really allowed them to take full control of the game. So again, I feel like a lot of that credit goes to Jam Jam, to where mixing that with the fact that he actually wins the game and also had such a great social game, I do feel like as a whole, he ends up being a pretty easy number one player from the new era to me. But there we go. That's my top 10 players from the new era of Survivor, which kind of feels like the formal end to my 44 coverage, in the fact that while obviously I did do the player ranking, which is typically the end of my coverage for a season, I did feel like this was a video that I've always been planning on making after 44. To where now that this is done, it feels like now we should just look forward to 45, which is still a ways away, though obviously I'll still be covering it like I have the previous few seasons. Though really up until then, obviously just expect the same style of Survivor ranking, casting videos, what ifs, all those sort of things down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.